I'm Daniel. I work with education at outreach at CEMUS. Great to be here. Great to see you, Ash.
I'm Eva. I also work as an educational coordinator here at CEMUS, and great to be here.
I'm Adam. I work as project assistant in pharmacy and medicinal chemistry, and I'm also a student of mathematics at bachelor level.
My name is Johan Margulis. I'm an economist and a political scientist, and I'm interested in consumer protection in financial markets and also the transition to green economy, that it should be sustainable both economically, social, and environmentally.
Hi, I'm Enki. I'm the course coordinator with Daniela on perspectives on climate change, eco-psychology, art and narratives. I'm also from Britain, so I'm like very much aware of everything that's happening with COP26, and I was also at a protest about it in Stockholm. So I'm very curious to hear from the side.
Daniela, I'm coordinating this team, and I'm curious what you will say because I haven't been that much updated on the COP recently.
Okay, and hi everyone, my name's Ash. I'm a course coordinator at CEMUS, and I'm here at COP26 doing reporting. So apologies, I was later today than usual. I'm at the Biodiversity Summit, so it's in a different building, and I was trying to find a quiet room, which didn't happen, but thankfully the events, everybody went back in. So yeah, it's been an interesting few days. I last spoke to you on Monday. I think to start, so yesterday was the Gender Day at COP. So every day they sort of focus on a different theme. And Gender Day, I mean, it was very interesting for myself to learn about how women are actually more affected by climate change because of the jobs that they have. So often more women work in agriculture, which is obviously a sector that's being more heavily impacted by climate change or feeling the effect straight away. And just seeing how that, particularly Indigenous women who were speaking on one of the panels that I went to, that they really are on the forefront of all of the harms from climate change. They have so much knowledge and sort of applications that can be used to solve it, but because they're also marginalized, their voice isn't getting through. So it's this sort of like a triple threat or double or whatever, that these people are suffering the most after contributing the least. They have the knowledge that could solve the problem, but because our societies have marginalized them, they don't have that space at the table to actually get their voices heard. I mean, there's been a lot of critique about access for different nations to be able to attend this COP. And there's also, I think, from the research that's been done, about 75% of the speakers have been men. So it's an issue access for, you know, different races, but also for women as well, that they're not getting to the spaces where they need to be to sort of have that influence.
Yep. And I think from the events here in CEMUS Library, I can't really remember what I was watching yesterday, but were there more events that you attended or issues that was brought up?
Yeah, so there was I was sort of flicking through my notes now, so it was interesting to hear about the effects of climate change and women in different places. And there was one young speaker on a panel who was from the Gambia, and she was saying that now young girls are being forced into child marriage and being sold because they can't, that's a sort of way to make income for families who are dependent on agriculture. And that just really like struck me as, you know, that's not what I thought climate change was. And if you think, you know, I mean, 10 years ago, there was the big push of these like polar bears on a tiny last little bit of ice. But to think that, you know, people are lacking food security, so they have to sell their children for marriage is such an extreme case of injustice that is happening, you know, and it's to young girls in the global south. Like, they could not be more marginalized. They could not have done less to cause this problem, and they're really suffering the worst effects. And I think it's a phrase that's been kind of, in some ways, I think it's losing its meaning, that it's the phrase of like those who have done the least or contributed the least are suffering the most. And it's a thing that I've basically just heard on loop for the last 2 weeks, but then hearing it applied to different contexts, that the phrase in itself is kind of, I mean, it sounds really awful to say losing its meaning, in the same way that net zero, people have talked about net zero, it's lost its meaning. The word sustainability has lost its meaning. And I think this phrase is to an extent, but then hearing those examples of like the horrors that individuals are having to go through because of climate change really hit home. And there was speakers, you know, I mean, Nancy Pelosi came and spoke at this event, which was interesting in that it's, you know, that the education of women and girls is one of the greatest solutions to climate change. That across every nation, it's seen that if you educate women and girls, then they have fewer children. They have, which is, you know, I mean, if you have fewer children, then there's less people to consume resources. And it's weird how it's kind of that, you know, educating women and girls should be justification in itself. There shouldn't have to be a greater sort of point of it, but then equally, there's a lot of talks. I mean, I'm at the biodiversity summit today, and there's talked about looking for co-benefits and crossovers, and that things shouldn't be working in silos. And by the sound of it, I mean, I'm getting told that there's been a lot of progress in COPs where now an intersectionality looking at issues of indigenous groups and gender and loss and damage, that's only just starting to come in, as well as biodiversity is quite new to have a space at the table at COP. And I think that it seems strange in some ways that it wasn't there before. But I guess it comes down to access and a seat at the table. That if, you know, I mean, now still 75% of speakers are men. You know, the access to indigenous groups is incredibly difficult for them to get here. So it's no wonder it's taken so long for them to have their voice heard and to get to start the ball rolling, because they've just been excluded from the conversation for so long.
Yeah, and I can repeat, everybody here in this room, you can just jump in. It's very informal, so there's no speaker order. So if you have a question, just interrupt and jump in. Yeah, and I keep thinking about what we touched upon on Monday as well, and how international negotiations, we haven't talked about negotiations at all, which is perfectly fine because we're getting to the end of this and then it might be reappearing more and more. But I think also in how do we implement, or not implement, but how do we work with these issues within the courses that we do, in the outreach events that we do at CEMUS, or activities, because the things far away or on an international level are really things that are hard to influence. But how we look upon these issues and how we involve different people in courses or in events seems to be at least something that we could maybe do differently without knowing exactly how it's done today.
Yeah,
okay.
I think with that in mind, that I mean, Zoom or you're being forced to work online has opened people to the possibility of that, you know, that instead of me being in the UK at COP, I could be anywhere in the world with an internet connection, which is most places, talking about any issue that affects me. So it's you know, I would really hope that now, because the access and the normality of the access to people all over the world has opened up, that institutions will utilize that to get people from different places. Because I'd heard so many times before, you know, from textbooks or documentaries about the issues affecting particularly indigenous women are on the kind of the far extreme of this, but it never really hit home until you see someone like literally crying that their whole civilization is gone, because it's their story, it's their issue. And I think that's the thing that's so important about representation, that, you know, I can't represent, others can't represent for them. You know, you can say the words, but it doesn't have the emotion, it doesn't have the connection and the communication ability that's needed, that you get when it's coming from that individual themselves. The point is, by just flicking through my notes, so there was a great phrase that this young woman from the Gambia also used, that women are often over-mentored and underfunded, which I thought really hits nail on the head. And then there was also a woman, I think she worked for the UN, and she said that only about 2.3% of private equity investment, so funding of businesses, is going to female-owned businesses. And that is, I think, that just seeing that, you know, if we're funding 98% of businesses that are funded are run by men, then it's just kind of perpetuating the same problems. And I think being here, that you can see there's a connection between masculine ideologies and capitalism, that if you were to let more women have more power, this system wouldn't be perpetuating itself, because they would see the greater impacts that it's having on different areas. I mean, I don't know how accurate that is. I don't know if you could assess that. But I think that the idea of, I mean, there was an indigenous woman from South America speaking on this panel and said that women are seen as custodians of the earth and holders and givers of seeds. And to them, you know, this idea of seeds is very symbolic, that it's preserving that life for the future, and it's about caring and this nurturing aspect. which I've never thought about in great depth before. But I think that, you know, the different perspective that women bring to the table, and the fact they make up 50% of the population, but they're just not, you know, half the solution has to come from there. There was another figure that was talking about, you know, if you were to think of who are the wealthiest individuals, and I guess you can pretty easily attach wealth to your CO2 emissions. The women aren't the wealthiest individuals. The wealthiest individuals are all men. And if you were to change not just that wealth, but the power within those companies that's given them the wealth, and put female leads in there, then how different the world could be within 5-10 years, I think is massive. But how you get people into that space is a different question.
Yeah. And maybe this is good now to switch to this question of how can we actually get these things going, or how could this actually look like? Because there's a different levels. It's like the climate finance thing we talked about last week, and basically financing infrastructure or adaptation projects or renewable energy. But then this is the loss and damages, and that was Monday, I think, about just like an insurance system, but it's not an insurance. How you actually pay people for the damages and the losses that they already have made because of climate change. And then it's the gender aspect that you brought up now. And the Green New Deal has been flying around as a concept. It's old, but it's new again. So because I especially invited you, you have some more knowledge about this, but what is your take on this, and how impossible is this to get done?
I think it was interesting to listen to that the theme of today at the COP26 is gender, and I mean, it's good that they bring up gender, but I'm sure they are in a state of just describing gender in the green transition to the green economy. I would just imagine last week when the theme was finance, that they didn't mention gender too much in their kind of financial plans for the transition to a green economy. And there, I think, is a big problem that there are many good wills. We want to have a transition to a green economy, and there are many good ideas that we want to implement. But when it comes to these issues dealing with finance, they are not present there. It's the usual suspects that are dealing with the issues. And I just wonder how it could be a change there. And what is your take from the conference on the politicians' kind of role in this transition? Because I think they leave it too much to the financial market actors in all these kind of standard settings, how to change to a green economy. That the transition is also about socioeconomic outcomes. It's not a neutral policy area. It has consequences for many people, and that it's only politicians, I would say, that can kind of steer and guide. And have there been any talks about these? It's like how politicians should take more responsibility on it when it comes to finance.
Not that I've seen. I mean, there's so many events and so many negotiations that I haven't actually seen that much from heads of state. So I was sitting in a funding meeting the other day when John Kerry was actually there, and it basically just every single nation went around and said how they're going to increase their financing. And we're talking, that they're going to double it by 2025, and all of these countries are given X millions or billions in some instances. And it's just kind of like, well, where is this money going? Who is it going to? Who gets to decide where that money's gone? And I think so often, I mean, from a gender perspective, that it's the people, the people who are signing these deals are men, and then they're giving that same money to men. And that, if you were to, from a financing perspective, just get more women to the top of finance, then we would see, I think, I don't know if I could use the term trickle down economics, but it would be the right type of trickle down. That if you have people at the top who are indigenous women or people from marginalized groups, then the decisions that they make and where they would direct that funding would then make it to the right places. Whereas at the moment, it's just sort of like seems to be bouncing around between wealthy white men. I think talking about the green economy is interesting. So Nancy Pelosi's speech was about including women in the development of the green economy. And for so long, women have been working in the green economy, and it's the caring economy. The caring economy is absolutely zero carbon. And it's just a thing that's been overlooked because it hasn't been monetized. And there's this big push of like, oh, let's train people that the green economy has to be about technology, and it's about electric vehicles and solar panels and all these things. Why is the green economy not care? Why is it not child support? Why is it not the arts? The arts can be a green economy. There are so many things, but I think as well that's a masculine point of view, that it's the green economy has to be technological, whereas it doesn't. And I mean, it's great that they're talking about including women within the sort of technical green economy. They absolutely deserve a space there because they've not had access to sort of engineering and technology backgrounds before. But I think that by overlooking the fact that women have been doing green work for centuries and it has been disregarded, it just shows a lack of understanding for what's actually going on. I mean, it was interesting. So there was a speaker who was from Lebanon, and I mean, Lebanon, that Beirut, isn't it, the capital city, exploded a few years ago, and that they're now trying to basically reconstruct the whole city. There's an 80% unemployment rate, like the country is in tatters. And she said reconstruction is all going to female-led firms and female-led workers. And I think that's a real build back better. That is saying, right, okay, this whole city has exploded and we're going to build back using female construction workers. And in Beirut, it's in the Middle East, a place where people would normally assume that their gender roles are very segregated, it's a very sexist society. And they've gone out from the government and said, no, this is going to be led by women. And I think doing that is, and in that industry within construction, even in Sweden that sees itself as a very feminist and equal place, women don't have a space in construction, not the space that they deserve. And then for Beirut to go out and say the whole rebuilding is going to be done by women, it's absolutely excellent to challenge those norms. And it's not just about building physical infrastructure better, but that psychological infrastructure, social infrastructure that needs to be built back better.
I agree with you that
answers your question.
The green technology and the finance, it's that it's kind of framing. It's also creating how the market will be implemented, and it's a masculine. I guess it's a masculine idea, and reading documents and reports from the conference and also prior the conference from standard setting agencies and regulatory agencies internationally. It's see that they are in the ESG. It's framing of the E into towards financial risk and financial stability kind of frameworks. And when it comes to gender, of course, they are not interested in gender. They are not interested in equality, and I see it's a big risk for a real transition of the towards the green economy. And they're putting a lot of emphasis on CO2. That is it's the representative of all other kind of environmental climate damages. And I think it's a little bit. When I read it, it's so risky just to look on carbon dioxide, and I see that the economic actors, they are framing it towards that. And I think it's so difficult to come up with I don't hear a different narrative. I mean, what is the narrative spoken of?
Well, maybe picking up on that idea of narrative. I mean, something I want to sort of pick up on, and what Ash was saying earlier, and kind of the general vibe of this conversation is a little bit like, how can we get women into these positions of power? Like, I think Ash, you might have even used the term, like, how can we get the women at the top of the finance? And I just sort of had this immediate, that means that we just have women in a system of exploitation. Like, the problem is that our systems and our economies are based on exploitation and profit, and that's sort of growth and all of those problems. And you'd probably end up with white feminism. You'd probably end up with white women in the positions of power, and you just have other forms of oppression and exploitation. And also, I would say that we don't want to be let's be gender equal in our oppression and our exploitation of the world. Like, we need to look more at like the system itself, I think. And I do see the argument that we have to work with what we've got. But I think there's also a problem about just thinking like, if we just shoehorn, and why is it always women have to catch up to men? Like, what about men being in the care economy that you were talking about? Like, it's always this thing of how can we get women to be like men? It's never like, oh, how can we get men to be more like women, and how can we just fundamentally deconstruct the binaries that we have in our societies.
Yeah, and I think also that for me, at least, if I can just have a very short comment as well, for me it is, how can we untangle this system? Because in a historical process, we ended up here. And that historical process is bit by bit building us into high carbon systems or whatever, oppressive systems. But then how do we untangle that? That is a neutral word of maybe tearing down certain structures and building up others. So that is the big question. That is also why I can't even understand the basics of economics. And maybe it's something to me, but there is there's levels of mystery into how it actually is working and how we're fed every day or paid.
That is the real problem, that it's like these issues, they are not paid properly. So it's difficult to understand, but when you get them explained, it's not that difficult, I would say. It's the financial markets is like they're gaining on that we have an idea that it's complex and difficult. If we could untangle that idea, we could achieve much more, because in the end it's about humans. And I think it's like regulation is the worst enemy for financial market actors. And if we can have regulation, we need to have politicians that don't think it's complex, because if they think it's complex, they would like to give the mandate to someone else, and that someone else is often if it's within the politics, is authorities, and they are very much alone in this world. They are not covered by politicians. They have their own like colleagues that they can talk to, but not politicians, and they don't feel that they have an urgency on pressing on these issues. So then it's like it comes to a balance act just to kind of make the show look green, because that's what politicians can do, and they have to do that.
And maybe it's very simple. Maybe that's how I should think about it, because it's also, if we talk about a billionaire tax or tax on profits, or you tax corporations in a different way, that frees up huge amount of resources or money basically to do, whether you want to do adaptation, you want to do finance projects in other parts of the world, or if you want to do some kind of reparations around loss of damages. Because I mean, during the pandemic, billionaires made more billions out of the system that they can profit when the rest of the world is not working, or it's not working out economically. So
I think it's so beautiful with the regulation. If you take like fund managers, it's like you have an index that if you have a green, as I talked before the meeting, it's like you have a green fund that has an index or it's actively managed. If you have a regulation that says it's like, if you the EU taxonomy comes close to that, but if you have a regulation that says it's like, if you have a green fund, you have to compare to a green index. You can't compare to a regular index. It's like, you can't. You need to tell your client, and this green index, it only includes companies that are at a certain kind of score on environmental kind of scale. Then you have then you have a pressure on the industry, because in these index funds they earn less. So then you have a different distribution. So you don't need taxes there. You need just a good regulation that kind of changes the distributions. So there's so much of this that can be done, and it needs to be done politically.
I think just to come back to a previous point about systems change. So I sat in, I literally sat in this talk for about 5 minutes and then had to walk out. This guy was from the US, and he was saying how we need to like increase the amount of electric cars on the vehicle by a factor of 5, and he was like, oh, that's going to be 30 million new electric vehicles, and then we're going to make like X thousand new charging points to keep up with all this demand. And it's just like, well, no, that's just greening the system that fails. Why don't we just have better public transport? It's literally just, it's just like, why are we still being like, oh, well, if everyone just owns their own car, we'll expand all this infrastructure. And so there was the same thing with a guy was talking about to end food waste and basically just getting shops to put like reduced stickers on stuff that's going to expire soon. But then the problem is, like, if we're still overproducing, then you're getting rid of the food waste issue in the shop, but you're not actually, if we're still overproducing, then there's still waste somewhere. It's probably you're just moving that waste from, maybe you'll reduce it a little bit, but you're just moving that waste from the shop to the home. And then we think about that, just the point that was raised as well about putting women in these institutions that are created by men. It's, I mean, I've learned the phrase of like youth washing over this, and it's that kind of female washing of, if you just put women in the same systems that fail, it's the same as putting electric cars instead of petrol cars, that it's not actually changing the institutions and the way that we work in the required way. It's just kind of making it a different shape, but not making the change bigger than it needs to be. And I think, like you were talking about the speeches of politicians as well, and it seems like so much of when people stand at that podium, there's often very little substance to it. It's just PR. That everything, like every speech that happens is just about looking good. And every nation has this thing, if it's a nation or a business or pavilions, it's all about who can look good, but they don't actually convey that much information. And it's really interesting walking around looking at the pavilions. So I saw yesterday, or just like really taking note, the Benelux pavilion stats. Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands have one combined. And now, I mean, Luxembourg has one of the highest emissions per capita, like the place is a tax haven. And all of their background is just wind turbines in the sky. And I think that it's this idea of marketing that we have in the global north. It's like a lifestyle-based marketing. And as soon as you look at that and the way it's set out, you get this like, be like nice and slow, and there's wind turbines, which makes you feel peaceful and it's green. But then if you go to like, so I think it's the Republic of Congo has a stand as well. And you notice in a lot of like designs from the African continent that they don't have that same like lifestyle branding that we have. Maybe they don't have it on their TV and in their social media, their general marketing. There's a lot of text that tells you what the thing does. And it's very explanatory. I guess it's the way that marketing would work in the global north before the Second World War and the Great Acceleration. But I think it's interesting that so much of the PR that you're seeing around is based on these symbols and ways of interpreting. But then anything that doesn't, I mean, I think it's ridiculous when you actually unpick it. But then also anything that doesn't fit into that is quite aesthetically unpleasing, even though it makes much more sense. Like logically, we should do things that way. But I think it's interesting how so much here, it's like you can just see how we've tapped into, or marketing experts have tapped into how the human brain works. And they have exploited that in such a way that's within a flawed system. And like you were saying, with how have politicians spoken about finance, and there's a lot of talk about finance. No one's talking about what they're not giving. So I sat next to one of the British MPs the other day. I don't think I mentioned this point with her, and she was saying that the UK is leading climate finance and that she'd lobbied to make sure that we could give more, I don't know the exact figures, but more than we were going to. And I said, well, that's great, but we also cut the aid budget this year. So the aid budget was at 1.6%. They dropped it down to 7% of GDP. And then they're also really happy that they've increased the climate budget. And it's creative accounting of the economic sense instead of the carbon sense. It's just kind of like, you can't really sell this and pretend that you didn't cut the other aid budget. So I just think that it's so hard to see anything authentic, particularly in the blue zone, because it's all so much about PR. And that's what I've liked about the protests, that at least it's real. Like you can see that the people, no one's standing there in the pouring rain on a Saturday afternoon for a reason other than that, they genuinely think this is a good thing to be doing and is purposeful.
Yeah, I think we touched on so many different issues. I don't know if you have to run as well, Ash, but maybe we can take a couple of more minutes, because I think also this kind of intense course over this 1.5 weeks and being out here listening, and you probably had it even more intense, Ash, in Glasgow. But I think it's also how to be pragmatic and find these kind of starting points that can actually start something, but at the same time trying to be very critical and try to see systems and try to go, like you mentioned, to not think in the same patterns that we always do and end up in the same kind of situation. Where would you just translate a car to an electric car and similar things? But from your perspective now, Ash, and we meet again tomorrow for the pub, and then we have the last session on Friday as well. Are there any other main kind of threads or things that you've picked up that we should build upon for these two last events, or maybe mainly the Friday event?
I think representation has been an issue that we've kind of come back to, you know, if that's of youth, Indigenous, Global South, women. And I always feel quite bad because I walk around the venue and I'm like, there's a lot of white European looking men here. And then I catch a glimpse of myself in the mirror and I'm not, and I think that as someone who is obviously part of the problem in that demographic, but then how can I, you know, I can't just donate my badge to a woman from Gambia. There isn't the sort of way to do that, and I think that could be an interesting way of how can men not represent, especially like white European men, shouldn't be representing anyone from the Global South, but how can we give people that platform? I think when it was the Gender Day yesterday, and I spoke to one of the Danish youth delegates afterwards, it was like, how can, you know, that men shouldn't be on the stage for those events, but then also looking in the audience was at least 80% female for the Gender Day. And I think that it's so important that we make people see all of these, you know, it's like a marginalized people's event, if that's women or Indigenous groups. But then they're only attended by those people who are suffering it. Whereas, you know, if it's an issue on gender, 80% of the room needs to be men, because at least 80% of the people who are attending COP are men. But in that room, it was all women. And I think that by people seeing like gender as a woman's issue and seeing Indigenous groups as, oh, it's just for them to worry about, that if you're part of the problem, you have to be the solution. And I think that's a really important thing. I've noticed as well, so today they said that it's the Biodiversity Summit, and they said that 92% of the agreements that have been made at COP so far have involved nature and how good that is. And I was, you know, I've been watching a lot of the thing Global South, and I've been really impressed at how important it all is. But when he said that, and I was like, oh, that's really good. And then my brain thought, well, I wonder what percent includes the words fossil fuels, because the Paris Agreement doesn't include the word fossil fuels, doesn't include the words decarbonisation. And it's sort of, you know, I mean, there's in some of the activist stands this idea that it's a false solution. And I think that to call it a false solution is a false dichotomy, that it's not that it's good or not, that we absolutely need nature. We need to conserve biodiversity for the sake of biodiversity, for human systems integrity, for food security. But then it is sort of like, you know, unless what we need to do is dig up 10% less fossil fuels every year from now on till forever. That's what we need to do. And all of the sort of solutions that are coming up and really being talked about and picked into are like end user changes and solutions. Whereas if you were to just start at the pump, it seems like it would logically make so much more sense to do that. Instead of measuring every single bit of emission, just dig up 10% less. That's what we need to do, because if you dig it up, you're going to burn it. But I mean, I'm guessing that the fossil fuel lobbies are far too powerful to actually get that implemented, because that's the most common sense solution. But it's not talked about.
Okay. Are there any more comments or questions from here in Uppsala? I want to say more about representation and how that's done, whether it's the COP or in a CEMUS course, but I think we can come back to that in the summary of all of this when you're back in Uppsala as well, or in Sweden, so we can get more into the details of this, because we also suffer from that. And when we invite a certain person, we kind of expect them to wear a certain hat, but they're actually an individual that's have a unique kind of focus on a work or an academic career, I suppose. Okay, yeah, but I think that's a wrap for today. If everybody's happy, we should keep in time, so you can also rush on to the next event, or wherever you're rushing. It's it's 12 for you as well, so it's lunch. It's not end of lunch. If you have 12 o'clock lunches there as well. So thanks so much, Ash. And for tomorrow, there is the live club at 4:15 our time, 3:15 your time. And hopefully you have a working internet connection and you can hopefully as well find a pub. Shouldn't be too rowdy in the afternoon, I'm hoping, but it's fine. And I made this yeah, for the people that are tired. And I made this very small flyer, so and I've handed out. So hopefully there will be more people here in the library, and maybe we can try to get some music going. And I don't know if everything is bagpipes and traditional music, but yeah, we'll figure that out tomorrow. Yeah. It's a different kind of indigenous way of doing things. Okay, but thanks for today, Ash, and take care, and we'll meet you again tomorrow in a pub setting. Okay.
That sounds excellent. Thanks, everyone, and thanks for attending.
Thank you.
It's nice to see more
Thank you so
faces there. Have a nice
Bye.
day. Thank you.